Welcome back to the John Fredericks Radio Show. This is your guest host, Mike Rubino, filling in for the Godzilla of the Truth, the Oracle of Deplorables, John Fredericks. I am thrilled this segment to introduce our next guest, Assistant to the President and Head of the Domestic Policy Council at the White House, Brooke Rollins. Brooke, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, I'm honored to be here, Mike. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. So I want to dive right in. I know that you recently moved over from the Office of American Innovation to the Domestic Policy Council. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Of course. I know that you're working hard to, make this White House's policies serve all of the people of this country, specifically the underserved. And obviously 2020 is a wild year. So wanted to dive in first with what's your vision, what's the president's vision for cities where, maybe the liberal policies have not necessarily gone particularly well for the residents there over these past several decades. So when it comes to police reform or other topics like that, what are the things you're doing to make this country better for all people?
Well, thank you for that question. My background is in Texas, and that's where I was for my whole life, but 15 years working in public policy before I joined the White House a couple of years ago. And I believe what Texas proved, what now this president is enacting across the country, is that our conservative values of lower taxes and less government not only mean opportunity for some, but truly mean prosperity and opportunity for all. And we saw that in Texas over a number of years, having the greatest job growth in the country, for 5 years creating more jobs than every other state combined with those policies. So it's really remarkable. The founders' vision of our laboratories of democracy, letting the states innovate and run their own government, and then figuring out what works. We know as conservatives that the more freedom we have, the better everyone does, but especially those at the lowest end of the socioeconomic ladder. So this president promised from day one he'd fight for all Americans, but especially forgotten Americans. Those are the Americans in our inner cities that their Democrat leadership you said it, generations, for decades and decades have failed them. And now this president has proven he can turn that around, and he did.
He absolutely did. I want to reference a tweet here, and I'm going to read it out loud for our listeners. It says, "At the request of many great Americans who live in the suburbs, and others, I am studying the AFFH housing regulation that is having a devastating impact on these once thriving suburban areas. Corrupt Joe Biden wants to make them much worse." That's in capitals. "Not fair to homeowners. I may end in capitals with an exclamation point." Serious tweet from a serious president. Brooke, what is the AFFH housing regulation? Tell our listeners about it.
I will. So the AFFH is an Obama-era housing regulation that basically works to destroy single-family homes and neighborhoods by requiring lots of regulations, heavy hand of the federal government, by requiring multi-family housing to be built in suburbs. It's an interesting war, frankly, by the Democrats, by the progressives, by the radical left, to basically abolish our suburbs. The Democrats hate houses and they hate cars, and they want to make it very difficult for the average American to have both. And that's basically, I think, why this president's focusing on this rule. He's all in on preserving the American dream, on ensuring that every American has a shot at, what that looks like, a great job and owning a home and having the freedom to raise your family in a way that you believe is right.
Well, in Oregon in 2019, they did away with single-family zoning statewide. California came very close last year. And the city most of the news these days for, quote unquote, defunding or abolishing the police. They also abolished single family housing zones at the beginning of this year. So that's Minneapolis. It's a very, I would say, hard left liberal policy. And it's very interesting. Everyone in 2020 talks about suburban people. They're just a huge voting bloc. Not going to talk about voters, but they're just a very key constituency of so many states, and obviously this White House appeals to all people, suburbanites especially. So, what can the Trump administration do to, to look at this regulation because it seems so overtly burdensome?
Absolutely. And it's interesting when we talk about the government getting more and more and more involved, all that does is just drive up costs, that we have a much less sort of effective policy that can get more people into the homes that they deserve and that they can afford. And truly, it's really just a federal takeover of American suburbs is what this rule is. So I will say for the last couple of years, Dr. Carson at HUD, our fabulous cabinet secretary, has been looking at this, and I know we're with just a few months left in term one, we're coming to the end of the process, which is why I think the president has decided that this is really a focus of his, and he wants to make sure that it's done right and that this war on the American dream from the radical left will stop with him.
So, let me ask this question. Obviously, I think every listener of the John Fredericks Show loves Dr. Carson. Moving on to, you mentioned end of the first term coming up. Second term, what are some second term priorities for the Trump administration? What do you as the head of the Domestic Policy Council see that you will be exploring in term two?
The pace of this White House, I have to believe and have been told, is so much faster and more than probably any other White House in the history of the country. So we're continuing to fight and to focus on every key issue that's important to the American people. Having said that, there's no question that jobs and the economy are top of mind because of the pandemic over the last couple of months. I mean, the president and his leadership basically led our country to the strongest economy, not just in the history of America, but in the history of the world, the lowest unemployment rates, the lowest poverty rates. And we have to do that again. We have to get this country back to work. And the people that have been hit the hardest are those in our minority communities, in our vulnerable communities. So I would say that would be top of line. But of course, his continued fight for an immigration system that is safe and fair and productive for all Americans, a healthcare system where people can afford, the cost has gone up so much, but we can focus on the cost, but also the choice of the doctor and making sure that we've got an effective healthcare system, again, for all Americans. Our infrastructure, this president has talked relentlessly about the failing bridges and roads and how we've got to reinvest in this country. Education, just yesterday, last night, talking about the president's tweeting, but just yesterday, the Supreme Court issued a final decision that really opens up the opportunity for more of our kids to have a chance at a really good education, which right now, especially in our inner cities, is just not the case. So top of mind, I would add to that, too, the American way of life. Preserving what makes this country great, which is not tearing down statues and burning businesses and destroying neighborhoods. Going back to what the great American experiment, the great American just civilization, Western civilization, what that looks like, and preserving that for our future generations.
Well, you mentioned a couple things there I want to touch on. First, the amazing economic recovery. I'm looking at some stats here that the Dow's had the best quarter in 33 years, up 17.77%. NASDAQ is up 30.63% in 90 days. And, that's 401ks, that's money in people's pocket. But that's in a matter of from March 31st to today. So it's just amazing. The policies, obviously, the underlying policies that this administration has put forth and the regulations that they've cut has allowed, the American economy to boom. You also mentioned, fixing our immigration system. We had an interesting guest on right before you with the Virginia Seafood Council that kind of dove into the H-2B visa program and how that's, disadvantageous to seafood manufacturers because of the seasonal labor pool that they are drawn from. But I think that's just more indicative of the fact that the federal government's constantly dealing with massive issues, with so many different voices speaking to you at once. And all the while, you're trying to serve every American at every level. So I have just two more questions for you, Brooke. If you can, detail out to me exactly what's going on with police reform. I'm here in Richmond, Virginia. Typically live in D.C., but I'm down in Richmond to host the show. And I'm driving around and there is graffiti everywhere. There's obviously an undercurrent that you can feel, it's palpable, of some discontent. And I know that this White House is putting these people's feelings and opinions first, and you're attempting to do something substantive and productive when it comes to police reform. So explain to our listeners what that is.
Well, I thank you for that opportunity. Obviously, the country is hurting. It is divided. But I will say that I think most Americans realize that the way out of this is not to divide or to defund the police. The way out is to unite our nation and to ensure safer communities for all Americans. And that's what this president has done. He's took decisive action on police reform. We brought law enforcement together with the families of those who had been betrayed by, one bad cop, unfortunately. And we put forward ideas in an executive order and have worked with everyone from both sides of the aisle to ensure that as we move forward as a country, that policing reform is part of that. Now, unfortunately, the Democrats, U.S. Senator Tim Scott has been so eloquent in describing first what needs to happen, but second how the Democrats just refuse to even come to the table to have that discussion is pretty telling in my mind. But this president is about bold and decisive action that unites all Americans and frankly provides a pathway forward, a trajectory where all Americans can succeed, but especially those with the least among us.
Well, that was very eloquently put. I think everyone who watched Tim Scott's speech was taken with it. It was an amazing speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Even yesterday, you mentioned that there was one rogue actor when it comes to the police. I was in Boston yesterday, and I watched a police officer pull his car and stop traffic, and he got out of his car, and there was a homeless man in a wheelchair, and he pushed the homeless man across the crosswalk on a busy divided highway. Not all police are bad, and I think the Trump administration making and highlighting that point is critical. And you're dealing with things that are policy regulations are different from each state to state. So this is all very important work. Last question, Brooke, and then I'll let you get back to work. You've mentioned the underserved communities. Talk to me about opportunity zones and exactly what's been done there, whether it's with historically black community colleges, work that Ben Carson's doing. Opportunity zones. Richmond, Virginia is, I think, ripe for one.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity to talk about opportunity zones. This president and the Tax Cut Act from a couple of years ago included the concept of opportunity zones. Talking about Senator Tim Scott, he was really a pioneer on the issue. But basically, 9,000 opportunity zones were identified and approved through the states. The states put them forward, and then the U.S. government approved them, that allow for investment into our economically distressed communities and having a tax benefit because of that. I think the latest numbers show almost $100 billion has flowed. This is before the pandemic and will happen again after. I think more money will be coming in that have flowed into our most distressed areas to bring new jobs, new hope, new opportunity for these communities. And it's really interesting. You pair that with the president's efforts on our historically black colleges, providing more than $1 billion to, and Hispanic serving institutions too, frankly, to make sure that they have the infrastructure they need to continue to serve these communities. When you pair that with the First Step Act, the president's leadership on true criminal justice reform that no Republican or Democrat was able to do until this president, who stands for law and order, but also stands for dignity and justice for all Americans. When you put all of that together and so much more, I think this president goes down in history as not just being the best for all Americans, but specifically his legacy being the president that lifted more Americans out of poverty and to the American dream than ever before.
Well, Brooke, thank you so much for joining me. Keep fighting the good fight. And if you can do me one favor.
Sure.
Tell Kamran Daravi that Mike Rubino says hi. And also, you have the best assistant in the business with Preston. So you have just the best team. I love everyone on the Domestic Policy Council.
I couldn't agree more with you. And I always say that you're standing on the shoulders of those around you. And I get to go on the radio, but none of this would happen without the extraordinary team, including Kamran, Roma, and Preston. So thank you for that shout out, Mike.
Of course. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks so much, and have a great 4th of July.
Thank you, Mike. God bless America. Thank you.
Of
Bye-bye.
course.